The idea of this video today is to go through a research paper, both to look at what it tells us as climbers and also to start learning about how to read a paper and how to interpret what it tells us, and can we rely on what it says? Is it a good quality paper? The one I've chosen is Risk Factors and Injury Prevention Strategies for Overuse Injuries in Adult Climbers. Quite a long title, and it's a systematic review, but hopefully you can get from the title about its relevance for myself as a physio and us as climbers. It's from the end of 2023, so still quite a recent paper, and it was published in Frontiers, the journal, Frontiers in Sports and Active Living. That's the important first stage. Is it in a good quality journal? Has it been peer reviewed? So in this case, yes, Frontiers, I can tell you, is a really, really good journal. I'm fortunate enough to know the editor, Gudmund, and it's been reviewed by James from Sheffield Climbing Clinic and Rehabbed from Spain. Once you start getting into the world and looking at these things, these are names that will come up. So we're getting a good idea that it's a good quality journal, great editor, it's been well reviewed and looked into. What it tells us initially on this first page is known as the abstract, where it's like a brief summary of what the paper has looked into and what its findings were. Interestingly, when people study the abstracts and look into them and what they tell us, they've often been found to be reasonably misleading. We are getting a little bit of a habit now of almost clickbaity sort of titles to get people interested and to look at it, which doesn't always represent exactly what they find. And within the abstract as well, there's a little bit of a habit of leaving out things that they might not want to go into too much detail over. So we can't rely purely on just looking at the abstract and saying this is what this paper definitely says. So we need to learn how to read the rest of it. We go to the introduction. I will look a couple of points here that are highlighted on the screen. One thing of interest, it tells us injury incidents from both traumatic and overuse injuries are at around 4.2 per 1,000 climbing hours. Now in this paper, it compares that to baseball and handball, both sports I don't really know a lot about. I don't know if they're high or low risk as far as injury goes. Looking at a paper that the British Journal of Sports Medicine did, again, another high quality journal, so we can rely hopefully on what it's put out. Football or soccer is around about 20 per 1,000 hours, 20 injuries, and rugby is around about 40 per 1,000 hours. So that actually gives us an idea that it's really not that high an injury rate within climbing. Then something known as the point prevalence of all injuries in climbers has been reported at 22.8%. So that means at any one time, basically 23% of climbers will have an injury. And then there is the 1 year prevalence of 50%. So roughly 50% of climbers will get injured in any given year. These are just giving us some nice sort of stats, I think, to build and start on. The one that really takes my attention here is that most injuries in climbing are thought to be overuse in origin, with up to 93% of injuries being overuse injuries. If we then consider the fact that all overuse injuries could be avoided, then we're starting to think, oh, hang on, there's something we can really do here to make a difference. And the idea of this paper being a systematic review is that they've taken quality studies that are out there and try to collate them and see what, if we put all of this information together, are there any strong threads that come out? So I think that's enough about looking at the sort of details and such like. We'll go through, after the introduction, it will tell you how they've selected the papers, data collection, data synthesis, this type of thing. We'll certainly leave that for here. That's the kind of thing that you rely on often, that the reviewers, the editor, the peer review process that goes on will have checked all the stats the methodology and such like, and found it to be good and robust. So for most of us, we can skip through that. We then come to where it's even actually talking about the results. And again, I'm going to move through that. This seems like I'm missing out an awful lot here, but this is the actual part where they are stating these were the results. What we want is, how have they interpreted those results? What conclusions have they drawn from those results? So this part here highlighted in red, the discussion. This is sort of hopefully kind of where the gold is. This is where nuance comes in, context, putting things into perspective, basically. They're open enough to say that a lot of the studies that we're working on weren't perfect, and they highlight the issues potentially with those. But then they're able to say in this multicolored section here, there is strong evidence that increased climbing intensity is associated with an increased risk of injury. I think most of us can kind of figure that one out anyway, but essentially the harder you're trying, the more risk there is of injury. Volume, interestingly, the link between volume and injury was much less clear. Now for me, that's something across most other sports and injury prevention, volume is often noted as the number one sort of enemy and number one cause. So that stood out to me. They do go on to say that actually within climbers in their early years, there is definitely a link with volume, or a strong link with volume. In the purple here, you can see, again, strong evidence that BMI and or body weight are not associated with an increased risk of injury. That's talking about a higher BMI or a higher body weight. So there's some nice confirmation there that we don't need to be worrying about our body weight being higher from an injury risk point of view. Moderate evidence that bouldering results in more injuries when compared to other disciplines of climbing. Looking into the data there as well, that shows that's particularly in males. So if we look at the intensity, and if you're male, you are much more likely to get injured. If we link that then in with, if you're in your early years of climbing and you're male and you boulder, yeah, your injury risk is way higher. Strength training was shown to be able to prevent shoulder and elbow injuries in 2 randomized controlled trials, although it was done on the same people in 2 different trials. And there's more and more of that coming through now, showing that strength training both boosts our performance and increases our ability to avoid injury. Limited evidence that warm-up and cool-downs, stretching, taping, hydration have any real influence on climbing injury. This is taken from within a climbing specific point of view. There isn't a huge body of evidence within climbing around warming up and such like. There is in many other sports, and they all show a really very positive correlation. So if you, for example, look at something like the FIFA 11 plus warm-up that footballers do, that's been shown across the board to have a huge influence on injury prevention. So what we're working from in climbing at the moment isn't exactly perfect. We're still building a body of evidence that's specific to our sport. The one that really stands out for myself is previous injury is highly predictive of sustaining future climbing injuries. That's not necessarily meaning that if you've injured your finger, you're going to get an ankle injury. But if you've sprained your ankle falling off before, you're way more likely to sprain your ankle again, unless you've done a full proper rehab on it. If that finger that was bothering you last winter, you only got it back to just, being sort of pain-free and having its range, but it still sort of flares up now and then, that is much more likely to become a problem again in future. And a lot of conflicting sort of evidence within that, which they then go into further detail of where in this multicoloured section they've actually stated, you know, there is strong evidence for this, there is limited evidence but seems to suggest. So it's really helpful for us to start gaining a picture, you know, and we don't need to look through all 13 pages of this in great detail. So then the next part that I would focus on while we're learning about papers would be the conclusion. So again, they're saying, what do we then do with these discoveries, these findings that we've got? So increased climbing intensity, bouldering is a higher risk of overuse injury. And so we should think about that in our training. It sounds like such a, you know, I'm laughing here because it's almost such an obvious thing, but most people don't. Climbing volume appears to be less relevant as a risk factor in general, but is a higher risk factor in specifically younger populations, and again, we also know in male populations. So we need to actually monitor what we're doing and consider where that person is in their training history and their sporting abilities and that type of thing when we're doing it. Strength and conditioning is a successful strategy. In this study, they're only able to say that for shoulders and elbows because that's the information that they had to work on that was climbing specific. But we know from other sports that's definitely something that we should pretty much all be doing. And what I always like to see in a study, and pretty much most studies likely will finish with saying something along the lines of, however, future studies are needed to look into this further. And what happens here a lot of the time is that these studies will highlight areas that we need to know more, and then hopefully the researchers go off and look into that. So within that, there's not much information. Again, I like the conclusion of this, that what's been measured so far within climbing are all the things that are easy to measure, if that makes sense. How much training have we done? How old is that person? How much do they weigh? How strong are they? That type of thing. And what this is really highlighting that hasn't been looked at are the things that we know from other sports, again, and science in general, that are super important. Things like psychosocial factors, sleep, nutrition, the basics, the things that I bang on about quite a lot, is reducing life stress as much as you can, getting good quality sleep in as much as you can. Nutrition is important, obviously, and doing the best that we can there before we start looking at all these other areas. So as a first look at a paper, this informs us of what a lot of us would say we already know. But it seems that for a lot of us, we almost need to see it with this badge of this is science. Researchers have said, you know, you should keep an eye on your training volume and your training load. Yep, can't disagree with that. Maybe there's an unresearched area at the moment around sleep, nutrition, psychosocial factors. Yeah, totally. A lot of this is confirming sort of what we already know. But that's quite powerful in that it's presented in this way. So yeah, a first look at things. It's a free access paper, which is lovely. All Frontiers things are. Have a look at the Frontiers website. Gudmund has put all of the climbing related information into a couple of sections now that you can easily find. So have a look, and if you've got any questions, feel free to ask. Yeah. I seem to always be very like, yeah, it'll just take 5 minutes, and then it doesn't take 5 minutes.